By September 1941, Operation Barbarossa had swept across the Eastern Front.
The German army brought the wrong close to the biggest war in history when Hitler launched his invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. He didn't just underestimate his enemy, he underestimated the planet itself. He believed that the war in the East would be over before the first snow fell. He was wrong, and because of that delusion, millions of German soldiers marched into Russia without winter coats, gloves, or boots and army dressed for summer. Before we begin, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, where we explore the most disastrous decisions that changed history forever. Operation Barbarossa began with the kind of confidence only arrogance can produce. Hitler's generals promised him a victory in 4 months. They believed the Soviet Union was a collapsing empire held together by propaganda and fear. In their minds, the Red Army was primitive, its leadership incompetent, its people unwilling to fight. The plan was simple: strike fast, strike hard, and the Soviet Union would crumble before the leaves turned yellow. That belief shaped everything about the invasion, including the logistics. The German High Command didn't plan for a long war. They didn't plan for rain, mud, or snow. They didn't even plan for basic survival beyond the autumn. Hitler's focus was on speed, not endurance. His armies would seize Soviet territory so fast that winter would never matter. The planners assumed Moscow would fall by October, Stalin would flee, and the rest of the Soviet Union would collapse under its own weight. That assumption created one of the greatest logistical failures in modern military history. The German supply system was already stretched thin, even before Barbarossa began. The invasion involved over 3 million men, 600,000 vehicles, and nearly 700,000 horses spread across a 1,800-mile front. Every tank, truck, and rifle had to be fueled, fed, and maintained through territory with almost no modern infrastructure. The Soviet rail system used a different gauge than Germany's, meaning captured railroads had to be rebuilt before they could carry supplies. Fuel and ammunition were already scarce. Adding winter gear, heaters, and antifreeze was considered unnecessary weight. It wasn't ignorance, it was arrogance. German generals raised concerns about the potential for a drawn-out campaign. They remembered Napoleon's disaster in 1812, when his Grande Armée froze and starved in the Russian winter. But Hitler dismissed those warnings. He believed he was smarter than history. "We have only to kick in the door," he told his commanders, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." To him, logistics were boring details. Ideology and willpower would win the war. So when the invasion began on June 22, 1941, the German army crossed the border wearing light field uniforms designed for European summer's thin wool, short boots, no insulation. Their tanks and trucks were filled with summer-grade oil that froze solid at low temperatures. Even the grease used in their guns became useless when the mercury dropped. But in those early months, it didn't matter. The summer campaign looked unstoppable. German forces smashed through Soviet defenses in massive encirclement battles, capturing millions of prisoners and advancing hundreds of miles in weeks. Cities like Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev fell in quick succession. The world watched as the Wehrmacht seemed to repeat the triumphs of France and Poland. The soldiers joked that they'd be home for Christmas, and their leaders believed it. But Russia is not Western Europe. As the summer faded, the terrain began to turn against them. In September and October, the rains came what the Russians called the Rasputitsa, the season of mud. Roads turned into rivers of sludge. Vehicles sank up to their axles. Tanks bogged down in endless muck. Supply trucks couldn't move. Soldiers tried to push vehicles free, their boots sucked into the mud as horses collapsed from exhaustion. Every mile forward was a physical battle against the earth itself. Then came the cold. By November, the first snow began to fall, and temperatures dropped below freezing. The thin uniforms that had been fine in June became death sentences. Men wrapped rags around their feet and hands to stop frostbite. They stole coats and blankets from dead Soviet soldiers. Some cut pieces of canvas from tents to wear as makeshift capes. Commanders begged for winter clothing, but none existed. Hitler had never authorized its production. The army quartermasters had no stockpiles, no factories making insulated boots, no rail lines capable of delivering supplies even if they did. It wasn't just clothing that froze. Engines wouldn't start. Fuel turned to sludge. Oil thickened until tank pistons cracked. Machine guns jammed after a few bursts. Artillery couldn't fire because the recoil mechanisms froze. Trucks that had survived the mud now died in the cold, abandoned along the roads like frozen carcasses. Horses still vital for transport collapsed by the thousands. Their bodies were used as cover against the wind. The men froze with them. By December 1941, temperatures near Moscow dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers began to die in their sleep. Others suffered frostbite so severe their fingers turned black and fell off. Some froze to death standing up while on guard duty. The Wehrmacht, which had once prided itself on precision and efficiency, had been reduced to scavenging for warmth. Entire divisions fought in stolen Soviet coats, mismatched civilian clothes, or layers of newspaper stuffed into their boots. Meanwhile, the Soviets, who had been dismissed as primitive, were thriving in the cold. Their troops wore sheepskin coats, felt boots, and fur-lined hats. Their rifles were designed to work in freezing temperatures. Their tanks, built for the Russian climate, ran smoothly while German engines failed. They were fighting on home ground with supply lines that stretched backward into the endless hinterlands. The very thing the Germans had ignored, the weather had become the Soviets' greatest ally. The turning point came in December, when the Red Army launched its counteroffensive outside Moscow. The Germans, who had advanced within sight of the city, were pushed back. They weren't defeated by superior numbers or tactics. They were defeated by physics. Their weapons wouldn't fire. Their vehicles wouldn't move. Their soldiers couldn't feel their hands. The psychological effect was just as devastating as the physical one. The myth of invincibility shattered. German soldiers who had marched across Europe without serious resistance were now dying by the thousands without even seeing the enemy. The weather had become the enemy, and it was merciless. The leadership in Berlin refused to face the truth. Hitler blamed his generals for cowardice and defeatism. He issued orders forbidding retreats and demanded that units hold positions at all costs, even when they had no supplies. Those costs were paid in blood and frost. Thousands froze where they stood because withdrawal meant execution. Operation Barbarossa had been built on ideology, not reality. The Nazi belief in racial superiority extended to logistics. They truly believed that German willpower could conquer nature itself. When that illusion met the Russian winter, it shattered completely. The war that Hitler thought would end in 4 months became a frozen nightmare that lasted 4 more years. The tragedy wasn't just the failure of planning, it was the refusal to plan. The German army had the knowledge, the industry, and the experience to prepare for winter warfare. They simply chose not to. They believed they didn't need to. They believed that the war would be over before the weather turned. That single assumption, the idea that they were too superior to fail, killed more German soldiers than any Soviet weapon. The army that had marched with machine-like precision across Europe froze in the fields of Russia because its leaders refused to buy coats. The war of annihilation that Hitler had promised became the war that annihilated his own army. And in the snow outside Moscow, under the same sky Napoleon's army had once perished beneath, history repeated itself. The Germans hadn't learned from 1812. They didn't even bring winter boots. Before the first snow fell, before the ice froze engines and flesh, another enemy appeared, one that didn't fire bullets or drop bombs. It was called Rasputitsa, the time without roads, known to German soldiers by another name, General Mud. It was nature's first blow against the Nazi war machine, and it struck with slow, suffocating precision. By late September 1941, the German advance had reached deep into Soviet territory. Hitler's armies had covered nearly 1,000 kilometers in 3 months, destroying entire Soviet formations in the process. Towns like Smolensk and Kiev had fallen, and the road to Moscow seemed open. But the deeper the Wehrmacht pushed, the further it stretched its supply lines. The Blitzkrieg, which depended on speed and coordination, was grinding down under its own momentum. The tanks were outrunning their fuel. The infantry was marching on foot for days. The horses that pulled artillery wagons were dying faster than they could be replaced. Then came the rain. In early October, heavy autumn rains swept across the vast plains of western Russia. The dry summer soil turned to sludge almost overnight. The unpaved roads, which had carried millions of German troops forward, dissolved into bottomless rivers of mud. Wheels sank, tracks clogged. Engines roared and sputtered. Tires spun helplessly, and vehicles that had driven from Paris to Minsk were suddenly useless in the Russian countryside. The Germans hadn't built for this. Their vehicles were designed for European roads, hard, dry, and narrow. In Russia, There were no real roads, only dirt paths and farm tracks. When those turned to mud, everything stopped. Tanks tried to forge ahead, but quickly bogged down, their tracks caked in clay so thick it hardened like cement when dry. Trucks carrying fuel and ammunition couldn't move at all. Horses, already malnourished from the long campaign, sank belly deep and died where they stood. A single rainstorm could delay an entire corps. Soldiers used wooden planks, logs, and even the bodies of dead animals to make paths for vehicles. They laid straw across the mud to create makeshift bridges, but it only sank deeper. Supply columns stretched for miles, immobilized. Crews abandoned their vehicles and tried to carry supplies by hand, but the mud sucked at their boots with every step. The once efficient German army became a column of exhausted men dragging sleds through a swamp. The Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, had turned into a slow, grinding crawl. The Wehrmacht had been built on the principle of momentum. Its tactics relied on constant forward motion, on the synchronization of tanks, infantry, and aircraft. When that rhythm broke, the entire system collapsed. The mud didn't just slow the Germans, it unmade their strategy. Planes couldn't land on flooded airfields, tanks couldn't maneuver, supply lines fell apart. Commanders who had planned days ahead were now planning hours ahead, and even that was optimistic. The impact was immediate and devastating. Units that were supposed to reach Moscow in weeks were suddenly stalled for days. Vital supplies, food, ammunition, medical equipment were trapped miles behind the front. Soldiers began to go hungry. Fuel ran short. Commanders radioed back desperate requests for resupply, but the trucks carrying those supplies were stuck somewhere behind them, wheels spinning uselessly in the mud. And the mud wasn't uniform. It wasn't predictable. In some places, it was a thin, slick film that made marching impossible. In others, it was several feet deep, swallowing vehicles whole. Soldiers described tanks sinking until only their turrets were visible above the surface. Attempts to tow them out often resulted in the towing vehicle getting trapped as well. The roadsides were littered with abandoned equipment engines still running, exhaust bubbling in the muck. The Germans tried to adapt, but their improvisations were primitive. They used logs and fence posts to reinforce roadbeds, but there were too few to cover the vast front. Engineers worked around the clock to repair bridges and reinforce roads, but the scale of the problem was beyond them. They were fighting geography itself. The Russians, however, were used to it. Their vehicles had wider tracks and better ground clearance. Their supply wagons were simpler, built for mud and snow. The Red Army had been born in this landscape, the Germans were visitors. The mud wasn't just a physical obstacle, it was a psychological one. Soldiers who had believed they were unstoppable now watched their machines fail. They cursed the land, the rain, and the planners who had promised an easy campaign. They tore off their boots, filled with water and clay, and walked barefoot just to move faster. Entire columns of men pushed on foot, while their officers shouted orders no one could obey. Meanwhile, the Soviets regrouped. The Rasputitsa slowed the Germans, but it also gave the Red Army time to rebuild. Soviet factories east of the Urals were still running, producing tanks, guns, and uniforms. Reinforcements poured toward Moscow. The Germans had assumed that by now, the Soviet Union would have collapsed. Instead, it was hardening. Every day the mud lasted. The Germans' window for victory closed a little more. The offensive had been timed for summer for a reason. Their supply lines depended on good weather, and their vehicles weren't equipped for the cold. Each delay meant fighting deeper into autumn, into shorter days and colder nights. By late October, soldiers were lighting fires in trenches just to dry their boots. Their uniforms were still thin. Their spirits were starting to crack. It's easy to underestimate mud, but for the German army, it was as deadly as any Soviet counterattack. The terrain became an equalizer. The same tanks that had rolled through France were now stuck beside peasant wagons. The same generals who had written manuals on fast warfare now found themselves commanding stationary troops. And the same soldiers who had been told they were superior found themselves powerless against rainwater and dirt. By November, the advance toward Moscow had slowed to a crawl. Hitler demanded results, but his commanders could do little more than send excuses. Every map report told the same story. Vehicles immobile, roads impassable, supplies missing. General Heinz Guderian, one of the architects of Blitzkrieg, wrote in his diary that the army had reached the limits of human endurance. It wasn't enemy fire. Stopping them, it was the ground beneath their feet. Even when the mud froze temporarily, the relief was short-lived. Vehicles began to move again, but as soon as the temperature dropped further, new problems emerged. Engines cracked, fuel froze, weapons jammed. The reprieve was brief a pause between two disasters. The army that had outrun its logistics in summer was now caught between mud and ice. The Rasputitsa was the moment the German war machine met reality. It was when nature reminded them that no amount of ideology or arrogance could conquer the land itself. The myth of German efficiency met the truth of Russian geography, and it lost. The Germans had believed they could plan the perfect campaign, that their timing, their technology, and their willpower would overcome any obstacle. But in Russia, timing belonged to the seasons. Technology broke under strain, and willpower froze with the mud. By the time the roads began to harden again, the opportunity to take Moscow had vanished. The delay caused by General Mud had cost them the element of surprise, the pace of their advance, and the energy of their troops. And as the last puddles turned to ice, the Germans realized the worst was still ahead. Because once the mud froze, the snow would fall, and then the real Russian winter would begin. When the Russian winter finally arrived, it did not strike with a storm, but with silence. The mud that had swallowed engines and horses solidified overnight into iron. The ground froze deep enough to crack under marching boots. The wind came next, cutting through every gap in the thin German uniforms. It carried no mercy-only cold that turned metal brittle and flesh gray. The Wehrmacht's pride had always been its machines. Tanks, trucks, and motorized columns, the steel backbone of blitzkrieg. But in the Russian winter, all that sophistication turned to weakness. The same technology that had overrun Europe was now freezing to death. The first sign of disaster appeared in the engines. Temperatures dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius. The lubricants in tanks and trucks thickened into solid paste. Oil and grease, meant to keep the gears spinning, turned into glue. Engines refused to start. Mechanics lit fires beneath tanks to thaw them, risking explosions just to make an engine cough back to life. When that failed, they used blowtorches, burning precious fuel to fight the cold. Water froze inside radiators and cracked engine blocks wide open. Vehicles left running overnight still froze solid by morning. Trucks that had once roared across Europe were now immovable lumps of steel. Soldiers tried to break ice from gearboxes with rifle butts and crowbars. Many destroyed the machines they were trying to save. Fuel lines solidified. Diesel turned to wax. The Germans hadn't brought enough antifreeze. Most of it had been considered unnecessary weight. They tried to improvise with alcohol, vodka, even urine. Nothing worked. The army that had been built on speed became motionless. Thousands of trucks and tanks stood silent on the road to Moscow. Frozen monuments to overconfidence. The cold didn't just stop the vehicles, it killed the weapons. Machine guns jammed after a few bursts. The oil inside them froze, locking the moving parts in place. Rifle bolts stuck. Artillery recoil systems failed because the hydraulic fluid turned solid. Soldiers urinated on their rifles to thaw them, then wrapped them in rags to keep them warm. The famous German precision engineering that had worked flawlessly in France and Poland broke down completely in Russia's winter air. Even the aircraft were grounded. The Luftwaffe couldn't maintain its planes in the cold. Engines cracked, wings iced over, and the ground crews lacked proper winter clothing. Runways froze solid and became unusable. The air war that had supported blitzkrieg simply vanished. On the ground, the troops were on their own. The Germans had no winter camouflage, no snow boots, and no gloves. They were still wearing the same thin wool uniforms they had worn in summer. Officers reported soldiers dying in their sleep from exposure. Men wrapped themselves in blankets, horse hides, or the clothing of dead Soviet soldiers. Some tore pages from books or newspapers to stuff inside their boots for insulation. They built fires from broken furniture, rifle stocks, and wrecked wagons. Every flame was an act of desperation. But even fire had limits. In the coldest nights, men froze sitting beside the flames. Others lost fingers, toes, and noses to frostbite. Medics had no morphine left, no bandages, no warmth. They cut off blackened limbs with knives heated over open fires. The wounded who couldn't move were left behind to die. The German army had marched into hell wearing summer uniforms. The collapse of mobility destroyed their strategy. Blitzkrieg relied on movement tanks breaking through, infantry following, supplies flowing. Now, none of that worked. The tanks couldn't move, the trucks couldn't deliver, and the infantry was too cold to fight. Commanders sent reports filled with phrases like vehicles immobilized, no fuel, and men frozen. The chain of command was breaking down. Meanwhile, the Soviet army was adapting. Their equipment worked. Their vehicles used winter lubricants. Their soldiers wore heavy coats and felt boots. They could move, fight, and survive. The German army, once the model of efficiency, now looked primitive by comparison. When the Red Army launched its counteroffensive in December 1941, the Germans were too cold to resist. Soviet tanks rolled forward across frozen ground, engines roaring in the same temperatures that had silenced the Wehrmacht. The Germans couldn't even dig proper trenches. The ground was too hard. The few tanks that could still move often froze again when stopped for more than a few hours. The retreat wasn't orderly. It was chaos in slow motion. At the front lines, soldiers described the sounds of winter, the cracking of rifles, frozen solid, the groaning of metal as it contracted, the screams of men whose feet were turning black. The cold was everywhere. It was in the air, in the weapons, in their lungs. Men coughed blood because the air froze inside their chests. The mechanized army that Hitler had promised would conquer the world was now fighting with shovels, bayonets, and captured Soviet coats. Entire divisions became static sitting in frozen foxholes, surrounded by vehicles that no longer ran. Generals who had once measured progress in kilometers per day now measured it in meters per week. The Soviet soldiers called them the Icemen, frozen where they stood, rifles clutched in their hands, eyes open. Sometimes a whole sentry line would be found dead, still standing at attention, frost covering their helmets and faces like a mask. The German leadership refused to believe the situation was as bad as reports claimed. Hitler forbade withdrawals and insisted that units hold fast, but holding fast meant dying in place. Commanders who ordered retreats were replaced or executed. Supplies never arrived. The winter campaign was no longer a military operation, it was a slow-motion disaster. Behind the front lines, supply convoys were paralyzed. The few trucks that could still move were used to transport the wounded back, not to bring food forward. Horses replaced engines. Wagons replaced trucks, but even the horses were dying. Their frozen bodies lined the roads, used as landmarks or makeshift barricades. Soldiers ate their flesh just to survive. The irony was cruel. The same German army that had built its reputation on mechanized warfare had now reverted to medieval survival, burning wooden wheels for warmth and fighting over dead animals for food. For the Soviet Union, winter was an ally. For the Germans, it was an enemy they couldn't shoot. The Wehrmacht's superiority in technology, training, and tactics had been neutralized by something no weapon could overcome: the cold indifference of nature. In the diaries of soldiers who survived, one phrase appears over and over again: the machines have stopped. It was more than a technical statement, it was symbolic. The machine of conquest, the engine of blitzkrieg, had finally seized up. The myth of invincibility was over. The frozen roads to Moscow were littered with the remains of tanks, trucks, and men frozen side by side. The precision gears, the polished tracks, the engines of conquest all locked in ice. The army that had raced through Europe faster than any in history now couldn't T-move at all. The cold didn't just destroy the army's weapons, it destroyed its illusion of control. The soldiers realized that no command, no rank, no discipline could fight the cold. They could shoot at the Soviets, they could not shoot at winter. And as the temperature dropped lower still, even Hitler's headquarters began to feel it. Reports came in from every front. Engines dead, roads blocked, units lost. He raged at his generals, accusing them of weakness. But the truth was simple: his army had frozen to death on the road to Moscow because he had refused to believe the world could get cold. By the end of December, the German army was a shadow of itself. It wasn't just defeated, it was immobilized. The same tanks that had conquered Poland, France, and the Balkans now sat frozen in the Russian snow, their crews huddled beside them for warmth. The cold had done what no army had managed to do before. It stopped Hitler's war machine completely. The German army had conquered Europe with tanks and steel, but in Russia, its deadliest enemy was invisible. It wasn't a bullet or a bomb, it was the cold. As the winter of 1941 deepened, the frost claimed more German soldiers than any Soviet rifle ever could. For every man shot, several more froze. The war that had once been fought with speed and machines turned into a slow massacre of flesh and bone. By December, temperatures on the Eastern Front fell to levels the Germans had never experienced. Thermometers broke at -40 degrees Celsius. The air itself felt solid, heavy, sharp enough to burn the lungs. Breath froze into crystals. Exposed skin turned white in seconds. The men who had once marched with confidence across Europe now fought simply to stay alive. The lack of winter clothing turned ordinary survival into a daily struggle. The standard German uniforma, thin wool tunic, and trousers was barely suited for a mild autumn. Boots were made from leather that stiffened and cracked in the cold. Socks froze solid overnight. Gloves were a luxury. Soldiers wrapped their hands in torn shirts, rags, or paper. They stuffed straw into their boots for insulation. It didn't help. Within weeks, frostbite became an epidemic. Fingers, toes, and ears turned black and fell off. Soldiers stumbled on frozen feet, skin sloughing away inside their boots. Some men tied their limbs with string in a desperate attempt to slow the spread of gangrene. Others cut off dead flesh themselves, using knives heated over small fires. In makeshift aid stations, doctors amputated hundreds of limbs a day, often without anesthesia. The German medical system was never built for this kind of war. It had been designed for fast-moving campaigns, where the wounded were evacuated quickly and the front line shifted every few days. Now the front was frozen in place. Medical trains couldn't move. Field hospitals were buried in snow. Supplies ran out. Bandages froze to wounds. Morphine froze in its vials. The wounded lay in unheated shelters, dying not from injury, but from cold. Reports from the front read more like descriptions of a natural disaster than a battle. In some divisions, frostbite cases outnumbered combat wounds 10 to 1. Whole units were incapacitated without ever seeing the enemy. Men were carried from their posts like statues, frozen stiff in their uniforms. The Sixth Army reported that it had lost nearly half its fighting strength not to Soviet fire, but to the weather. The scale of the suffering was impossible to hide. Commanders begged for winter gear, but there was none. Hitler's logistical officers had made no preparations for a cold weather campaign. The factories in Germany hadn't produced the needed clothing because the war plan had never included winter. By the time the reality set in, it was too late. Even when shipments of coats and boots were finally ordered, they were delayed by the same frozen railways and impassable roads that crippled everything else. Soldiers learned to improvise. They looted villages for furs and blankets. They took coats and boots from dead Soviet soldiers, sometimes stripping corpses in the snow. They burned their own vehicles to keep warm. They slept inside, destroyed tanks, huddled around the last embers of engine fires. But no amount of ingenuity could stop the temperature from killing. The cold didn't just destroy bodies, it broke minds. The constant pain, exhaustion, and hunger eroded morale. Men stopped writing letters home because their hands couldn't hold pens. Conversations shrank to grunts and gestures. Soldiers began to speak of the cold as if it were a living thing, a hunter that followed them, always watching for one moment of weakness. Psychiatrists later described this as cold shock, a condition where prolonged exposure leads to apathy and detachment. Men froze not just because they lacked warmth, but because they stopped caring. They sat down in the snow, closed their eyes, and never woke up. Officers tried to keep discipline, but even their authority froze. Orders lost meaning when soldiers couldn't move their fingers to hold their rifles. The German command tried to maintain the illusion of control. Official reports downplayed the losses. Phrases like cold injuries and temporary frostbite replaced the reality of frozen corpses piled behind the lines. But the statistics told the truth. By the end of the winter, over 100,000 cases of frostbite had been officially recorded, an estimate. Historians now consider conservative. The real number was likely far higher. At the height of the crisis, entire divisions were pulled off the front just to survive. The men who returned to the rear were often unrecognizable, wrapped in bloody bandages, faces swollen from frost, eyes sunken. Some had no noses or ears. Others had lost both hands. The medical staff could do little more than cut away dead tissue and pray. The hospitals were scenes of quiet horror rows of men moaning softly in the dark, the smell of rotting flesh mixing with antiseptic and diesel fumes. And through it all, the fighting continued. The Red Army pressed forward, their soldiers wrapped in thick coats, moving easily through snow that paralyzed the Germans. Soviet snipers hunted the shivering men in white camouflage that the Germans didn't have. The sound of Soviet artillery echoed across frozen fields where German troops could not even dig trenches deep enough to hide. The Wehrmacht's morale shattered. The soldiers knew they had been abandoned by their own command. They weren't just freezing, they were forgotten. Letters from the front described resentment and disbelief. "They told us we'd be home by Christmas," one wrote. "Now we burn wood from coffins to stay alive." Another wrote simply, "The cold is the only enemy we cannot fight." Even the officers began to lose faith. Generals like Guderian and Bach sent furious messages to Berlin demanding winter equipment, accusing the high command of negligence. Hitler's response was fury. He refused to admit error. He insisted that the army would adapt, that the German soldier is stronger than the elements. But strength meant nothing when fingers froze to rifles and soldiers collapsed in the snow. The longer the winter dragged on, the more the army decayed. Units were reorganized to cover losses that no longer came from combat. Battalion rosters were filled with men who couldn't fight, men missing limbs, men too weak to march. The vaunted German efficiency, once legendary, disintegrated under the weight of starvation, sickness, and cold. Diseases spread as men huddled together for warmth. Lice and fleas thrived under filthy uniforms that hadn't been changed for months. Pneumonia and typhus tore through the ranks. The same soldiers who had conquered Europe without fear were now terrified of fever and frostbite. They were dying faster than reinforcements could reach them. For the Soviet Union, the suffering was not less, but it was expected. Their soldiers were used to the cold. Their uniforms, equipment, and tactics were designed for it. For the Germans, it was alien, unbearable, and humiliating. The army that had promised the thousand-year Reich was being erased by the simple physics of freezing water. When spring finally came, the thaw revealed the full cost. Fields that had been covered in snow were now filled with bodies. Men, horses, and machines lay half buried in the mud, preserved by ice. The German army had not been defeated by superior numbers or strategy. It had been undone by its own arrogance. The winter of 1941-42 became the graveyard of the Wehrmacht's confidence. The frost had taken what no enemy could, the belief that the German soldier was invincible. By the end of that first Russian winter, the Wehrmacht had lost nearly 500,000 men, many of them not from bullets or bombs, but from the cold that had seeped through every layer of unpreparedness. The greatest mechanized army on earth had frozen to death in its tracks. The failure to prepare for the Russian winter was indeed just a logistical mistake. It was the single decision that turned a bold invasion into a doomed campaign. The frost, the mud, the broken machines, and the dead soldiers were not just symptoms of bad luck. They were the direct consequences of a fantasy. Hitler's belief that the Soviet Union would fall before winter was not strategy, it was delusion. And when that delusion met the real world, it cost Germany the war. By December 1941, the German advance had stopped cold. The once unstoppable blitzkrieg was now a motionless, freezing mass of men and machinery stretching hundreds of miles across Russia. The roads were clogged with wrecked vehicles and frozen corpses. The supply lines were dead. The army's fuel was gone, its clothing inadequate, and its morale shattered. The Wehrmacht, which had been designed for speed and surprise, was now an army that could neither move nor defend itself properly. The immediate result was the collapse of the offensive toward Moscow. The German army had reached the outskirts of the Soviet capitals. Some units could see the city, as faint glow on the horizon, but the advance stopped short. Tanks froze in their trenches. Artillery couldn't fire. Soldiers were dying faster than replacements could arrive. The generals begged Hitler to allow a withdrawal to regroup and consolidate, but he refused. He ordered them to stand fast and fight to the last man, claiming that the German will could overcome nature. It couldn't. The weather didn't stop for ideology. By the time the Red Army launched its counteroffensive in early December, the Germans were already half destroyed. The Soviets, dressed in fur-lined coats and felt boots, moved swiftly across terrain that had paralyzed the invaders. They hit the frozen German lines with fresh troops, ski battalions, and tanks equipped for sub-zero conditions. The attack caught the Wehrmacht completely off guard. The counteroffensive around Moscow drove the Germans back dozens of miles, reclaiming towns and villages that had been captured only weeks earlier. For the first time in the war, the German army retreated en masse. It wasn't an organized withdrawal. It was a collapse. Units dissolved into chaos, abandoning heavy equipment to save their lives. Tanks that couldn't be moved were blown up. Artillery was left behind, buried under snow. The same men who had once marched in perfect formation were now stumbling through the white wasteland, starving, frostbitten, and broken. The human cost was staggering. By the end of the winter, Germany had lost over 500,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. Entire divisions ceased to exist. The Sixth Army, which had once been one of Hitler's elite forces, reported that it had lost nearly all its motorized transport. The mechanized army that had swept through Europe in 1940 was now reduced to horses and sleds. But the physical losses were only part of the damage. The psychological blow was even greater. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered. The Red Army, which the Nazis had dismissed as inferior, had not only survived, had pushed the Germans back. For the first time, Hitler's armies faced an enemy that could outlast them. The illusion of quick victory was gone, replaced by the grim reality of a war that would drag on for years. The strategic consequences of that first winter were irreversible. The failure to take Moscow meant the failure to knock the Soviet Union out of the war. Stalin's government, factories, and command centers had already been relocated east of the Ural Mountains, safely beyond German reach. Even as the Germans froze outside Moscow, Soviet industry was ramping up. New tanks, planes, and weapons were rolling off assembly lines that Hitler's armies would never reach. The Red Army was learning, adapting, and growing stronger. Meanwhile, Germany was bleeding resources it could never replace. The fuel and ammunition consumed during the failed drive to Moscow had drained reserves across the Reich. The factories that produced replacement vehicles and equipment were already overextended, supplying the existing front lines. Every tank destroyed in Russia was one that could not be replaced. Every truck frozen in the mud meant another gap in logistics. The offensive had not just failed it, had bankrupted Germany's ability to wage war at that scale again. This was the fatal strategic cost of ignoring the winter. The Wehrmacht entered Russia as an offensive army, designed for short, decisive campaigns. After the winter of 1941-42, it would never regain that momentum. Every German offensive after Barbarossa was smaller, slower, and weaker. From that point on, the war in the East was defensive, a retreat fought over millions of square miles of land that Germany had no way to hold. Hitler refused to see it that way. In his headquarters, he convinced himself that the setbacks were temporary. He blamed his generals for cowardice, his soldiers for weakness, and the weather for betrayal. But the numbers didn't lie. The losses of that winter crippled the Wehrmacht's fighting strength permanently. The units that survived were exhausted and under-equipped. Their vehicles were wrecked, their morale broken, and their confidence gone. By spring, the Red Army had regained its footing. Soviet intelligence estimated correctly that the Germans no longer had the strength to renew a large-scale assault on Moscow. Instead, Hitler turned his attention south, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad. It was a desperate shift, born not of opportunity, but of necessity. The failure before Moscow had taught him nothing. He still believed he could outrun reality. But the seeds of Stalingrad's disaster were planted in the snows outside Moscow, where the first cracks in his war machine appeared. The winter of 1941 also changed how Germany's allies viewed the war. Japan, which had been considering an attack on the Soviet Union from the east, abandoned the idea after seeing what had happened to the Wehrmacht. Italy and Hungary, whose smaller contingents had been sent to support the invasion, saw their own forces crippled by the same conditions. The Axis unity that Hitler had boasted of began to fracture under the weight of the frozen failure. Even within Germany, faith in victory began to erode. The propaganda machine in Berlin still spoke of progress and perseverance, but the letters home told a different story. Families received reports of frostbite, starvation, and missing sons. Factories worked around the clock to replace lost equipment, but the losses were too vast. Hitler had promised the German people that the war in the East would be swift. By the end of that first winter, they knew it would not be. The strategic fallout went beyond the battlefield. The failure to conquer the Soviet Union forced Germany into a war of attrition it could never win. The Eastern Front became a black hole for men and material, swallowing every resource the Reich could produce. Every ton of steel, every drop of fuel, every rifle produced in Germany after 1941 was sent east. The rest of the war, the defeats in North Africa, the bombing of German cities, even the eventual Allied invasion of France, were all shaped by the losses suffered in that first Russian winter. The dream of a quick victory had died in the snow. The reality that replaced it was grim and endless. The Wehrmacht would continue to fight for 3.5 more years, but it would never again fight from a position of strength. The cold had taken more than lives it, had taken momentum. The Soviets knew it. The Germans felt it. And the war that Hitler had planned as a lightning strike had turned into a slow, grinding collapse. The failure to prepare for the winter of 1941 wasn't just a tactical error, it was the point of no return. From that winter onward, Germany's war in the East became a long retreat. The men who survived the frost carried the memory of it through every battle that followed through Stalingrad, Kursk, and the final march back to Berlin. They had seen the truth that their leaders refused to admit. The war had been lost, not by the Soviets' brilliance or the Allies' strength, but by the arrogance of those who thought they could fight the world's harshest winter without a coat.